Take a seat. I want to start out by just kind of looking at America for a moment from the standpoint of government. We have a government like all nations have a government of some type. This year, there's 195 nations at the UN. So we have 195 nations. Guys, if we can get that up, thank you. There's 195 different nations at the UN. They all have a government of some type. Now, what's interesting is our Constitution we did in 1787. We ratified it in 1788, and we've been operating under the Constitution since 1789. So America's only ever had one Constitution. If you look across the rest of the world, it's very interesting to see how many constitutions they've had in that same period of time or less. Imagine living in nations where you have this many constitutions in the same or less period of time than America has. In America, we often take for granted the stability we have. It's a real blessing, but we don't recognize that because that's all we've ever known. We haven't known other things. Last year, we had a congressional delegation in Poland, and I was talking to people in Poland, alive people talking to me who have lived through 7 constitutions in their lifetime. So if you look, South Korea, that's a stable nation. We think of it as a stable nation. It's an ally. 6 constitutions since 1948. We don't think in those terms. And so literally, if you were to ask the question, what's the average length of a constitution in the history of the world? The answer is 17 years. So 17 years is what a nation averages. That's an average nation is 17 years in the Constitution. We're at 233 this year. That's not average. That's very different. We are the exception. We're not the rule. No other nation has been the same length of time under a Constitution as America has. If you look at what America enjoys in the way of creativity, America has 4% of the world's population, and 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of whatever. But that's not the case in America. Our 4% of the world's population, we produce more innovation, more technology, more medical cures, more discoveries, more symphonies, more plays, more books, more everything than the other 96% of the world combined. So our 4% produces more than the rest of the world. We take for granted all the technology we enjoy. I was in Germany a couple of years ago, do a lot of speaking at U.S. military bases, and so I was in Germany there, and I got to stay at a 5-star hotel in Germany, and that's pretty cool, because that is an ancient nation. It goes back centuries and centuries and centuries, and so there I am at this 5-star hotel in Germany, and for a cowboy kind of guy from Texas, that's a big deal. And it would have been really nice if they would have had internet at their hotel. We've got internet at Motel 6 here. I mean, everybody's got internet. See, there's so much we take for granted that the rest of the world doesn't enjoy. The same when you look at prosperity. Our 4% of the world's population produces 25% of the world's gross domestic product. And it's not that we have more, we have much fewer natural resources than other nations. For example, agriculture, the kind of lifestyle that I have on the ranch. Agriculture, America is number 66 in the world in percentage of farmable land, but America is number 2 in the world in farm production. So we're way down with natural resources. We're way up. America takes what we have and makes it go further than any other nation. So this is what's become historically known as American exceptionalism. Now, that phrase drives professors through the roof today. America is not exceptional. Yes, we are. There's all sorts of statistics. It's not a matter of arrogance or pride or anything else. That's just the fact. America is the exception, not the rule. We have stability when other nations don't. We have prosperity when other nations don't. We have creativity when other nations. We're the exception, not the rule. So the question becomes, so how did you get there? Who's responsible for all this that America enjoys and that America often takes for granted? And if you look at leaders, invariably textbooks will point to political leaders. They'll point to people like George Washington. They'll point to founders like John Hancock or John Adams, and those are all fine. I mean, they had a huge role in helping America have the form of government that's been so special. But what's interesting is if you go back to when John Adams was an old man, the millennial, if you will, of his generation, the younger generation of his time, a guy named Hezekiah Niles came to him and said, hey, I'm doing a history book. This was 1816. And so I've got this history book from 1818. If you were here yesterday, you know that we own about 120,000 documents from before 1812. So thousands of documents of the guys we call founding fathers. Well, I've got that textbook that Hezekiah Niles did, 1818. So 1816, he writes John Adams and said, look, we were young, we weren't part of it back there, we're really enjoying what we have in the nation now, but I'm writing this history book and I need to know from you as a participant, as an eyewitness, as a guy who was in it, who were the most important people back then? Who do you look to as the most important people? And so when John Adams was asked that, he had a number of names. And among the names he included were people like the Reverend Samuel Cooper. He said the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew. He called out the Reverend George Whitfield and the Reverend Charles Chauncey. He went through and listed preachers. Now, those aren't the guys we find in history books today, but that's who he thought was really significant back then. And we don't list preachers today, whether they're white or whether they're black. We usually don't even know who they are. So if you add Richard Allen and you add people like Absalom Jones or John Marrant or Lemuel Haynes or Harry Hoosier, I don't think I know those names. Let me just take a story from Harry Hoosier for a minute. Harry Hoosier, really interesting guy. Harry Hoosier had been a slave. He became a Christian. He was freed. He ends up working with Francis Asbury. Now, if you know anything about Francis Asbury, he's part of the Great Awakenings, part of the revivals we had in America. Francis Asbury spent most of his ministry on horseback. The guy rode 300,000 miles on horseback sharing the gospel all over the country. Had a huge impact, had huge crowds. People came out in mass numbers to hear him. Well, Francis also had Harry preach at those revival meetings. And Harry actually got larger crowds than Asbury did. So Asbury gets these massive, we know the name Asbury today, we don't know Harry Hoosier. Benjamin Rush, who's the signer of the Declaration of Independence, said, I heard Harry preach. He said, he's the greatest orator I've ever heard. Well, he's heard all the other guys. He's heard the Patrick Henrys and the Jeffersons, and he said, no, the best orator I've ever heard is Harry Hoosier. Well, Harry, as he works, all these people get converted under his ministry, and so their ministry, by and large, it was kind of a blue-collar ministry because they're riding everywhere, they're on horseback, they're out in the woods, and they're out in the farm countries, and they're out in the rural areas, and all these blue-collar guys are kind of getting converted, and you got mountain men in there, and you got frontiersmen, and you got explorer and woodsmen. And a lot of the revivals they conducted were out kind of in the rural areas of eastern Pennsylvania and elsewhere. And so as these guys get converted, they are explorers, they are woodsmen, they are frontiers guys, and so they start moving toward the west because they want the rough country. And as they get into the west, they get into this country here, and people in that country looked at them and said, these guys behave a little different than everybody else. That's because they're Hoosiers. Now, why would they be called Hoosiers? Because they were converts of Harry Hoosier. I wonder how many people in Indiana today know that they were named after a black evangelist. Probably very few. Now, it would seem like that might be something we should cover in history, but like Columbus yesterday, if you were here, we don't cover this stuff anymore. We don't know where the name Hoosier came from. Well, we actually do know where the name Hoosier came from. We just don't tell that anymore. And there's so many more stories like that. If I take you to this guy named John Marrant, when John Marrant was 13 years old, he was in Charleston, South Carolina. And as he was in South Carolina, he was a child prodigy in music. He was great on the French horn, the violin. He was probably the most sought-after guy in town to play to play concerts, but to play for private parties and everything else. So he was raking in lots of money. And he said he was on his way, he and a friend were on a way to play for a party one time, private party, and they went by a meeting house, which is a church. And he says he went by the meeting house, he said he heard a crazy man inside hallooing at the crowd. Well, the crazy man actually happened to be George Whitfield, who was preaching in the Great Awakening. And so as John went by, he and his friend talked about it, and he said, hey, let's go in and let's see what's going on. The friend said, there's no way I'm going to that meeting. He said, yeah, come on, let's go see. And the friend said, I'll only go in there if you promise to take out your horn and break up the meeting. And John said, I'm down with that. Let's do it. So they go inside. John pulls his horn out. He starts to blow the horn to break up the meeting. And he said that as he started to blow the horn, Whitfield spun and turned and pointed at him and said, prepare to meet thy God. And when he said that, Marrant said he fell down speechless and senseless, just hit the deck, was out, couldn't move at all. And so people were concerned about him. They came, tried to get him up. They couldn't revive him. They couldn't get him up. He was laying there on the floor, speechless and senseless. They called for medical people to come try to see what the problem was. Well, the meeting continues to go on, and at the end, about a half hour later, Whitfield's finished, and he comes back and he looks at John laying there on the ground, just paralyzed, just can't move. And he looks at him and says, so, the Lord Jesus has got thee at last. He said, I've got a friend. He said, I would love to spend time with you, but I'm leaving town. I have more meetings, but I will send a friend to talk to you about what's happened to you. And so they got John up, they carried him home, they got him in bed at home, they called for more doctors to see what was wrong, why he couldn't move, and why he was semi-paralyzed. And so a couple days later, a preacher shows up at the front door and says, George Whitfield asked me to come meet with you. And so he went in beside John on the bed. John was laying on the bed, and the preacher said, can I pray for you? And John said, no, no. And he said, he took my hand and prayed for me. And he said, as he took my hand, I was so fearful that I actually rolled off the bed on the other side. So he hits the floor on the back side of the bed. The preacher picks him up, puts him back on the bed, grabs his hand, prays for him, said, how do you feel? And John said, I feel terrible. This is worse. He said, well, let me pray again. No. So he prayed again. How do you feel? I feel really bad. So he prayed a third time. How do you feel? And John said, I feel really different. Something's going on. And so he actually ends up having a dramatic conversion to Christ. And he had such a dramatic conversion, got such a love for Jesus and the Word of God and the Bible, that his family thought he went way too far off the edge. And so the family, as John said, they did everything to me except that which was good. So they really persecuted him. So here he is, 13 years old, and they want him out of the home. They don't want anything to do with what he's got. So he heads out in the woods. He just leaves the house. He's basically been thrown out. And as he gets in the woods, he meets up with the Cherokee Brave. And this Cherokee Brave that's in the woods, for the next 10 weeks, they just kind of hang around together, and so they hunt together, and they do all sorts of stuff together, and good relationship, good friendship. At the end of 10 weeks, the Brave says, I have to go back to my tribe. John said, well, I don't have anywhere to go. I've been living here in the woods with you. And so the Brave says, well, come on with me. And John says, well, the Cherokees have a law that any outsider of their tribe will be killed. And then the Brave said, I'll speak for you. It'll be all right. So as they went to the tribe, they got there, and the chief, when they saw John Marrant, the chief said, kill him. And so they started coming to kill John, and the Brave tried to speak, and they hauled the Brave off to the side. They held John. They had a trial. They had what was called the judge and the executioner, and John called him the king. He was the chief of the tribe. And so they sentenced him to death because he should not have been in the village. So they put him in a hut. And John had his Bible with him, because when he left home, he had the Bible with him. So they put him in a hut, and as he's been sentenced to death, and the executioner has shown him how he's going to die, and it was barbaric. John records all of this. So as he's in that hut, he's praying that night, and he at first is scared of dying. He says, but wait a minute. If I die, I get to be with Jesus. This is really good. So he starts praying all night, and he's praying to Jesus, and the executioner has a guard on the hut to make sure he doesn't get away, and the guard tells the executioner, he's in there talking to somebody. I don't know who's in there. I don't know how they got in, but he's in there talking to somebody. So the executioner throws the door open and goes in. Who are you talking to? I'm talking to Jesus. I don't see anybody. Well, he's here. And so it ends up, the executioner gets converted. The judge gets converted. They take him to the king because they don't want him to be killed now. And the king is really angry at him. And actually, when he starts talking to the king's daughter, 16-year-old, here's what John says, and she gets converted, and she goes over and grabs his Bible and hugs it and puts it up to her ear and kisses the Bible. And the king is so angry, he says, you got my daughter under a spell. You free her from that spell right now, or I'll chop you to pieces in front of me. Well, it ends up the king gets converted. So the whole tribe gets converted. So this Cherokee chief says to John, he says, we've got a lot of allied tribes around here. Why don't you go speak to all these other tribes, because they need to hear what you've told us. And so, but he says, the deal is, if you go in, they're going to do to you what we try to do to you, and that's kill you. So I'm going to take my personal bodyguards, 50 of them, I'm going to send them with you, and I want you to go from tribe to tribe to tribe, and those bodyguards will make sure nothing happens to you. So John ends up becoming Cherokee for all practical purposes. He dressed the same way, painted his face the same way, did everything the same, looked exactly like a Cherokee. And for the next 2 years, he went from tribe to tribe, converted them to Christianity. Went from not only from the Cherokee, but to the Catawba, to the Hoosier, to the Creek. 13 and 14 years old, he's the first black American to successfully evangelize Native Americans in America. Terrific, terrific story. John actually recorded that story. He wrote a narrative here. You can see the narrative, 1785. Here's a copy, early copy of that narrative. This is one of the 2 best-selling black narratives in American history, was a story of John Marrant, and we've never ever heard of the story today. It's just kind of gone and not there anymore. You have the same difficulty when you come to Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel Haynes, a very famous name, or should be. He was a famous preacher across New England and states like Vermont and New York and Massachusetts, elsewhere. And this is actually an original painting of him back in the founding era. Now, would you please look at that painting and tell me something about his congregation? They're all white. They can't do that. They were all racist back then. Again, bad history. There's just so much more to the story than what we hear. And so you see him here with this congregation. An interesting thing about him, he is the first black man in American history to receive a degree of higher education. And you would think in history books we would want to do first. We would want to talk about first. And so the first black man to break through and receive a degree in higher education. He's also the first black man to have a sermon published. This is a published sermon of Lemuel Haynes from back in the day. So he's the first black man to have a published sermon. And in addition to that, it's interesting, Lemuel Haynes was also a soldier in the American Revolution. He was one of the Minutemen, one of the famous Minutemen. And so he served under George Washington. And in his churches, on George Washington's birthday, he would give a sermon on his commander-in-chief, George Washington, with whom, and we're told how racist Washington is and all the statues of Washington have to come down. And again, we have such an incomplete story today. Here you have black heroes from previous generations who knew Washington, who were with him, who praised Washington, who actually preached sermons about Washington. And actually, this book right here, this is the Bible of Lemuel Haynes. And inside his Bible, you see his name sketched inside the Bible. I'll try to be careful opening this and show you, but this is the Bible of Lemuel Haynes, and there is his name on the inside of that cover. So he's a real guy, and he's a really cool guy. We just don't know anything about him today. So many others. Let me go through some chronological stuff for a minute. I want to take you to the American Revolution. Let's go to 1775 of April. April 1775 is when we have Paul Revere making his famous ride. Now, as Paul Revere rides, it turns out that throughout the Revolution there were a number of times that people made Paul Revere kind of rides. And so Paul Revere was not the only one who rode to alert the Patriots. Others did so as well. And one of those guys who rode to alert the Patriots was a guy named Wentworth Cheswell. He's a black patriot. Now, Wentworth Cheswell up in New Hampshire, interesting thing about Wentworth Cheswell is the first black man elected to office in America. Well, I can't say that. We had blacks elected to office in 1641 and 1642 in colonies like Maryland, etc. But in 1768, in the colonial era, he's elected to office. Now, these are a number of documents from Wentworth Cheswell. And by the way, I love the fact that in the American Revolution, it was blacks and whites doing so much together. And it's a narrative you won't hear today. But again, we've got so much of the history, so much of the documents, so much of the old textbooks. But he's the first guy elected to office in America. These are some of the documents from Wentworth Cheswell when he was a judge. He served not only, and by the way, he was reelected for 49 years. This is one of the documents when he was a judge. He was reelected for 49 years. And across those 49 years, he held 8 different political positions. Now, his town was very white, and he is clearly black. And they elected him to office, just like they did in so many other places, just like you had Lemuel Haynes, the black pastor of a white congregation. There was racism in America, but systemic and institutional? No, it existed in locations and locales. It existed in places in the South. But as you get into New England area and as you get into northern United States, very, very, very different story. Now, interestingly enough, Wentworth Cheswell is not only a patriot, but he's a historian. He is responsible for these books right here. This is the first history done of New Hampshire. So he is a scholar, he is a patriot, he is a political leader, he's all sorts of stuff. You would think the textbooks would want to talk about the first black guy elected to office in colonial America. Gone. Nothing there, nothing said about it. So as you move past that, we go back to Paul Revere. He's making his ride. When Paul Revere makes his ride, he is looking for 2 individuals. He's got to find Hancock and he's got to find John Adams because the British have ordered them to be executed on the spot. All the other patriots can be forgiven, but these 2 guys have to be executed. So as Revere rides, he's riding to the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark because that's where the political leaders stayed, was with the church leaders. And so they're here in the town of Lexington, and they're here with Jonas Clark. And when word gets there, and Hancock and Adams turned to Pastor Clark and said, "Pastor, Are your people ready for this? He said, of course they are. He said, I've trained them for this very hour. So the next morning actually, is when we have the first battle of the American Revolution. It's the Battle of Lexington. And it occurred when 70 men from his church went out to take on 800 British citizens. And so often in the American Revolution, it was churches that went out to defend their town. So the Reverend Jonas Clark, his church goes out, and at the end of the battle, there were 18 Americans lying on the ground, dead and wounded. Those 18 Americans included white patriots like John Robinson, black patriots like Prince Estabrook. White and black laying on the ground together because they all went to church together. They were all out of his church. They were all fellow parishioners. Now, that again is not the story we hear. And by the way, Prince Estabrook, even back in the day, they did monuments to Prince Estabrook way back then. They're still doing monuments to Prince Estabrook today. It's just that unless you're there to see them, we don't study this in history anymore. Now, we used to know who Prince Estabrook is. Don't know the guy anymore. If you go to June of 1775, this is the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is now 3 battles later. This is the 4th battle of the Revolution. And so the Battle of Bunker Hill, this is printed by a guy named John Trumbull, who's called the painter of the American Revolution. All of that, and then you got over there. He put 2 guys off on the side, to make sure you would see them, to make sure you'd see this guy right here, Peter Salem. Peter Salem is the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so put him off there away from the crowd so you could tell who's there. And he's standing right there beside Thomas Grosvenor again, black and white, side by side. You had this cooperation going on for so long. So Peter Salem is the guy that literally saved countless American lives that day. After the battle, they presented him commander-in-chief. He had dozens of military commendations from officers on all of the courage, heroism he did. We don't hear that name, but we used to. As a matter of fact, here's a textbook from the 1840s. And in the textbook in the 1840s, who are we showing as the Battle of Bunker Hill? The clear hero there, the clear patriot is Peter Salem. Then you go to the 1870s. Now we're into color pictures in the textbooks, but we're still showing the clear hero as Peter Salem. By the way, in that same battle was also another hero named Salem Poor. He also was a black patriot. He also received numerous commendations that day. So the heroes of the Battle of Bunker Hill were black patriots. We don't know that today. We used to know that back then. So again, and by the way, what do you think would happen with race relations in general if we knew more of our own history? If we knew more of what happened, we would have a different view of all sorts of things. This is where not knowing history has a huge impact on public policy. If you don't know history and what's happened, then you can be talked into all sorts of things that are counterproductive and are completely antithetical to what the nation really stood for. Now, and that's not saying we didn't have racism. We definitely had racism. We're going to talk more about that later, but you just need to know there's another part of the story. So as you move into December 1776, this is when George Washington is making the famous crossing of the Delaware. This is when we have the really first major victory in the American Revolution, and we look up there and say, those are great patriots, except we just don't know who they are. We used to know who that guy was. He was Prince Whipple, black patriot who served throughout the American Revolution. By the way, it's interesting, black patriots in the American Revolution on average served 9 times longer than white patriots did. White patriots averaged serving 6 months, that was their enlistment. Black patriots averaged serving 4.5 years. They kept re-enlisting and re-enlisting and re-enlisting, and they served quite a lot of patriotism. You just don't hear anything about it. Other black patriots back in that day, part of the Battle of Princeton and Trenton would be Oliver Cromwell. Again, these were names that we knew, and I can tell you the story of Prince Whipple. Pretty cool story. He actually is associated with the signer of the Declaration, William Whipple, from up in Rhode Island. So there's fun stuff there. If you go to July of 1777, this may be one of my most fun stories in the American Revolution. I enjoy this one thoroughly. At this point in the American Revolution, still very young in the Revolution, and George Washington's commander-in-chief and second in command is Charles Lee. Now, Charles Lee has just been captured by the British. So we've lost our second in command, and that's a big blow to the American military. We need this guy back. How do you get him back? You need to have a prisoner exchange. Well, that means you're going to have to get the British second in command and have a prisoner exchange, second in command for second in command. British second in command is Richard Prescott. Richard Prescott is actually in the middle of Rhode Island. He's in the middle of Rhode Island, the harbor there in Newport, and there's an island in the middle of the harbor that has a British fort surrounded by the British fleet, and he's in the fort in the middle of the British troops, in the middle of the British fleet. How are you going to get him out of there? Well, what happens is a man named Colonel William Barton says, I've got a plan. And his plan essentially was what we would call the first special forces type of operation. And he got the guys together and he said, I've got a plan here. It's a wild idea. He said, probably we'll all die as a result. It's a suicide kind of a mission. So I'm only taking volunteers. Who wants to volunteer for this? And so 40 guys volunteered, 20 blacks and 20 whites volunteered. And right up front was a guy named Jack Sisson. Jack Sisson, actually, after he volunteered, he is the guy who got in the lead boat and took the lead. And so as we decide that we've got to go to the island and get him, we know that we need to pass the island at night or go to the island at night. So what he did was they got all these boats together, and you got to go through the British Navy. So, I don't know, 1 or 2 in the morning, somewhere in there, they got these boats, and they did what they called muffling the oars. They took the oars of the boats and they wrapped them with cloth so that as you're rowing in the water, you don't hear the splash. You hear a real quiet. And that hopefully wouldn't wake the British up on the ship. So they rode right under the ships, right through the ships. They got to the island. There were guards on the island, but they weren't expecting anything. They're surrounded with British ships. So the Americans quickly knocked out the guards on the island. After they knocked out the guards, now they got to find out where the generals stand. And General Prescott was back in a barred room with a bar on the inside of the door, big oak door. And so they look at that and say, oh my gosh, to beat that door down, we'll wake up everybody in the area. We won't get off of here. And at that point is when Jack Sisson said, got it. You guys get out of my way. What happened, if you've ever seen the movie Princess Bride, it was that kind of a moment. That was Jack. Jack said, got this. So what Jack did was he backed up down the hallway, he put his head and shoulder down and ran right through the door, broke the iron hinges off it, got into the room. When he got in the room, he quickly went over to the general and just knocked him out cold with a punch. Picked him up, put him under his arm, and walked out like a sack of potatoes, got back in the boat, went across the bar. It's just... They have their prisoner exchange, and America gets its second in command back because of a bunch of commandos led by a black commando named Jack Sisson, and literally that was the beginning of what we would call kind of the special forces stuff. So here's a fun story. If you get into 1781, this is the final battle of the American Revolution. Young General Marquis de Lafayette, French general who had come here and brought the French Navy and French Army. Without his help, we couldn't have won. Standing beside him is this man right here. Now, I often ask classes, who is that black guy? Oh, that's his slave. No, it's not. That is not his slave. That is James Armistead. Lafayette was one of the many anti-slavery. He was really strong anti-slavery. And what happened is Armistead and Lafayette form a friendship. And as they do, and they're talking together, Lafayette, or actually Armistead says, I want to do something to help in the war. And Lafayette's, well, what we really need, George Washington's tasked me to try to find intelligence on the enemy, and we really haven't been good at that. We don't know what the British are doing until they do it, and it's too late to respond then, so they get us with surprise attacks that we didn't know were coming. And so James says, I think I can do something with that. And Armistead and Lafayette says, well, it's really dangerous. Well, I can do it. So what he does is James Armistead goes straggling into the British camp and says, oh, I'm a runaway slave. I hate the Americans. They are so mean to me. They so mistreat me. And so the British said, you're welcome in our place. And so he starts serving, very diligently serving the soldiers there, doing anything for them, being like a servant and a waiter for them, almost a slave for them. And as that goes on, one of the British generals looks at him and says, man, you're so good at this, you should be serving more than just soldiers. You should serve us officers. And so the general who picked him up as a servant was a general named Benedict Arnold. Now, Benedict Arnold, if you don't know, was the American general who was the traitor who became the British general. Now, as a British general, he reaches out and says, James, come serve me. James, happy to. And so James comes in and starts serving, and because Benedict Arnold is one of the generals, he's associated with Cornwallis, and they're having meetings with all the generals, and here is Armistead hearing all the stuff that's happening. And so he's smuggling the word back at night to Washington and to Lafayette, and they're finding out what's happening. And so suddenly the Americans are able to avoid the traps the British are setting for them. We know they're happening before they happen, so we're not losing all the Americans we lost, and the British attacks aren't as successful. Well, what happens is Benedict Arnold gets set out on a mission, and so James Armistead stays behind, and Cornwallis goes to him and said, hey, James, would you mind just serving me? Because Benedict Arnold's gone, serve me. He said, happy to serve you. And so he brings James in one day, and he sits him down and says, James, I've got a real problem. He said, there's a spy in our camp. And James is like, oh, no. And so Cornwallis explains, he says, somebody is taking our information and getting it to the Americans, and so we're not as successful as we had been. They're being able to avoid our traps. He says, I don't know who it is. I'm going to ask you to do something really hard. Would you become a spy for us and go back to the Americans? No, you hate the Americans, but would you go back there and be a spy for us? He becomes the first double spy in American history. So James Armistead is the guy who feeds Washington the intelligence on what Cornwallis is doing that allows Washington and Lafayette to bottle them up. And so the Battle of Yorktown occurred because of the intelligence of James Armistead, who got them the information on what Cornwallis was about to do. And then there was also a providential intervention of God where God changed the weather and cut Cornwallis's troops in half. But between God's intervention and James Armistead, he's the hero of the battle. And so James Armistead, Washington and others credit him with what happened with American independence as one of the key factors. And that's kind of like the beginning of military intelligence. I mean, there's so many cool guys back there that we hear nothing about today. So I'm going to give you one more, and then we're going to change directions here for the last half that we've got. 1793, this is a newspaper from 1793. And this newspaper from 1793 has this. I'm going to read it to you in case it's not large enough. In the borough of Easton, Pennsylvania, a free Negro man of the name of Thomas Hercules was on the 6th day of July last chosen town clerk of that borough by a decided majority of votes. This we mention as proof of the growing liberality of the present age, when virtue and worth alone, and not mere color or trippery of rank and splendor, begin to recommend a man to places of trust and confidence. So here's a black man elected in an overwhelmingly white town. They say, we love this. This proves that all we care about is how good someone is. We don't care about their color. We don't care what kind of background they've got. We care about whether they're competent to be able to handle the job. Now see, this is 1793, and there were blacks elected across the states back then. Now, not in the southern states, and see what happens today is you can look at the southern states where it's very pro-slavery. You can look at the northern states, which are very anti-slavery, and you look at the middle states, which is kind of a mix between it. What we do in history today is we take the southern view and make it look like all of race view. And that's a bad view. Why don't we take the northern view and make it look like, oh no, that would make blacks look really good and whites look really good, can't do that. So we are into teaching a lot of negative stuff today. And I showed you that yesterday at church if you were here. So what happens is we don't hear these kind of accounts because they all came out of the north, and we don't do a good job of telling northern history. We want to tell southern history where it's really bad and impressive. And so what you have here, what I think is significant here is what we're now learning in the last 10 years regarding race and science. DNA results came out just a few years ago on an extensive test done by the Smithsonian, done by National Geographic, done by groups that are big into science, and they did a lot of DNA testing. And this is what they came back with. They said all races share 99.99% of the same genetic materials, which means that a division of race is largely subjective. Now it's interesting, a division of race is largely subjective. Now what they pointed out was this is when they came out with the announcement that according to what we see on DNA, according to what we know in science, man could not have come from anything other than previous humans. Man did not come from other species. He came only from humans. They said, therefore, we think there's a common human ancestor somewhere back there, Adam and Eve. We think there's a common human ancestor somewhere back there, and it can't be more than 100,000 years ago. Well, what happened to all this billions of years in evolution and intermediary species? And so now DNA, that's why it didn't get a whole lot of coverage. It got some coverage, but they came out and said race is largely subjective. And if you don't know, there's only 4 races in the world scientifically. Now, there are about 30,000 ethnicities. You have the Negro race, you have the Anglo race, you have the Australian race, and what are called the Mongoloid races, which would be the Native Americans. So only four races that are out there, but there are 30,000 some odd ethnicities. So a division of race is largely subjective. What they found in that study is that any two humans, take me, I'm a little guy, take LeBron James. He's a big black guy. LeBron James and I have more in common with our DNA than do any two identical twins from the same mother in nature. You take two identical twins to a giraffe mother or to a hippopotamus mother, anything. You take any two identical twins, LeBron James and I have more in common with our DNA than two identical twins in nature. That's amazing stuff, and that's what blew the scientists away as well. So a division of race is largely subjective. We're focused on things that really don't matter in the eyes of God. That's why in Acts 17:26 he said he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. Hey, that's what the scientists just affirmed. From one man came all the men who live on the face of the earth, of course that one man was Adam. And how many generations are we downstream from Adam right now? In the history of the world, we're about 150 generations downstream. That's what we are. I was speaking at a large black church not long ago, about 8,000 members. I'm the only white guy in the church. And I said, hey, if you didn't know it, I'm your cousin. You know, I may be your 150th cousin, but we all came from the same parents. And so if you get that perspective that we all came from the same parents, that we have a single human parent, then that's what the Bible told us in Acts 17:26. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. We're all related. Now, the other thing we're told in the scriptures, 1 Samuel 16:7, the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, God looks on the inward appearance. So we look about color, and we look about distinctions, and we look about eye colors or hair formations or height or whatever it is. God doesn't. He looks only in the inside, which what that tells us is the biblical view of man is that there are only two races that exist. Not two races, two groups. The only two groups that exist are those that know God and those that don't know God. That's the only distinction God makes. He doesn't care a whit about what you look like on the outside. He cares what you look like on the inside. He's not looking at the outside. He's looking to see, do you know Him? Do you obey Him? Do you follow Him? Do you take His word? Because everything else is superfluous. It largely is subjective. So this is a good lesson that comes out of that. Now, let me go forward from that to where we are right now and see if in the remaining time I've got, I can take you through 8 important points you need to know. The modern view of racism that we have today is largely white on black. That's the way we teach it in school, is white oppression of black, etc. And that's where we get all the stuff on white privilege. So this is basically new stuff over the last 10 to 12 years. If you haven't had a long academic career, then you weren't being taught this 20 years ago. You are being taught this now. So when you look back at this, the relationship between blacks and whites today has much to do with the historical view of slavery. The way we present history today is what justifies the way we look at things. If you're only going to present Southern view of history, then you can say there was big white oppression of blacks. But to do that, you even have to omit some Southern views of history. So I'm going to take you through some of that other history. So there's some important things to know about slavery, and I'm going to cover 8 important facts that you need to know. And before I do that, let's just start with a simple premise. Does everybody agree that racism is a sin? Yes. Everybody agree with that? Okay. What that means is it therefore applies to all humans. You don't have white sins or black sins or red sins or any other color sins. Sin is a human condition. So if racism is a sin, it's a human problem. You don't just have Texas sins or California sins. It's not it. Humans have sin. And so when you look at it from that standpoint, that racism is a sin, it affects all humans. Great example is what happened in Rwanda about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago now, however long it was. You had 1 million people killed when the Tutsis and the Hutus went after each other. It was racism. We don't like your race, but you're both black. Yeah, but you're tall and we're short and you're race. If everybody in the world was black, we would divide up over whether you have black with blue eyes or black with brown eyes or black with gray eyes. We would find a way to divide up. We'd find a way to divide up over the color of your hair, the shape of your face. That's a human problem. So you find that so many things that go on in Africa, it's racism, but it's black on black. Wait a minute, we're told that it's white on black. No, it's a human problem because it's a sin problem. It's a heart problem. And because it is, it's easy to divide into groups when we shouldn't. So it affects all human beings. Now, let me take you through some of the first things. First out, we're not going to say in any way, shape, fashion, or form that slavery was a good deal. It was inhumane and barbaric. American slavery, that's why we have pictures of stuff like this. We have a lot of artifacts at WallBuilders to show the inhumanity of slavery, just bad ideas behind it. So it's barbaric, it's not a good deal. The treatment of other individuals, you would never be able to justify this before God. He said, and the way you treated someone else, the way you've treated me. Remember Matthew 25? Can't stand up with this kind of stuff at all. How many times do you have to be beat on your back to have scars that tall? I've got scars on me from working outside and ranching and everything else. I don't have any scars that are half-inch tall. I have to be beat how many times to have scars like that? So first, let's just put it aside. Slavery, inhumane, barbaric, bad deal. No justification, not going to defend slavery. Having said that, let's move to the next points. Second point is that America was not a world leader in the global slave trade. Now, that shocks a lot of people today. This is a map of the global slave trade. And if you look at the global slave trade, the African slave trade ran from 1501 to 1875. This is considered the official dates. And the official dates of the African slave trade, there were 12.7 million Africans taken out of Africa as slaves. They were enslaved and sent somewhere else. Now, that heat map shows who went where. And so if you look at where these slaves went, 12.7 million, and about 2 million died on the voyage across. About 10.5 million actually made it to destination. You find that 43% of all African slaves went to Portugal and Brazil. You find that 24% went to Great Britain, 15% went to Spain, 11% went to France, 5% went to the Dutch, 2.5% went to the United States, 1% went to Denmark. Now, as it turns out, the United States is one of the lesser nations for receiving slaves out of Africa. We had a professor tell one of the kids, we do a lot of leadership training with young people, 18 to 25 in college, had a professor tell the kids all 12 million of those slaves went to America. No, not even close. You see, it's not, how come nobody's talking about Portugal and Brazil with the slave trade, but everybody's talking about America with the slave trade? Well, let's talk about America. The 300,000 slaves that came here, not a good deal. But to say that America is the root of all evil with race, oh no, not by a long shot, because again, it's a human problem. And many nations had much worse. The more evangelical Christianity you had, the less of an issue you had with this. And we'll look at that a little later as well. But notice how that over here, my laser won't show up on the screen. But notice how that the lines are coming from the inside of Africa, not from the, you've got coming off the coast of Africa. What's going on the inside of Africa? What's going on the inside of Africa? It was black tribes that would capture other black tribes and sell them to the Muslims or to the Spanish or to the Portuguese to ship out. So black tribes made money off of enslaving other black tribes. We just bought a group of 7 swords recently. These are all slave trader swords from the inter-African slave trade, where the blacks were enslaving and killing other tribes and selling them to the Muslims to make money on it. So that's why you have all the line. How did all the slaves get to the coast to be shipped somewhere? Somebody had to get them there. Yeah, they got there because black tribes were enslaving and killing other black tribes to make money, and that's what they did, was sell them to Muslim slave traders who sent them all over the world. So and by the way, those things are really old swords, and I am telling you, they are still razor sharp. One of our guys picked one up and got cut on it just when he grabbed it, because he had no idea it was still so sharp. So that's what's going on the inside there. So all nations had slavery. It was a global condition. Now, did you know that the first nation in the world to ban the slave trade was America? We did it in 1807. Oh, wow. Think of that. 200 years ago is the first nation to ban it. See, we talk today like slavery has always been an abomination in the history of the world. It's not. America was the first to ban the slave trade in 1807. Thomas Jefferson signed a law on that. The British quickly thereafter. Next fact to know is that America was the 4th nation in the world to ban slavery. First nation was Great Britain, 1833. Then you had Denmark, and I think then France. We're the 4th. When did we ban slavery? 1865. Wow, it's only been 150 years that people have been banning slavery. We were one of the first to do it. See, America was one of the world, there were 124 nations back then. America was one of the world's leader in trying to end slavery. We were the first to end the slave trade. We were the 4th to ban slavery. So that doesn't fit the narrative today that America is a source of all evil and racism. America was one of the world leaders in trying to change things. So that's why if you look at this map right here, these are the nations in the world today and where slavery is today. Did you know that right now, while we're gathered here, there are still 94 nations who are members of the UN who have not made slavery illegal? Still 94. If you want to talk about slavery in the world, let's talk about the nations that still have it going right now. Because right now there are 40 million active slaves in the world today. I help run an organization that we rescue people out of slavery, and unlike other organizations, we do it with guys who will go in and snatch the slaves right out from under the slave owners. 2 of our guys have been killed rescuing slaves. One of them's been shot 17 times and keeps going back to rescue slaves. Slavery is a huge issue today, and we're focused on America with all the good things we have in America. Sure, we got some bad things because humans are involved. But you compare America today to these other nations that are going, 40 million today. As a matter of fact, there are more slaves today than there were in the entire history of the African slave trade. So we're focused on something that happened 200, 300, 400 years ago instead of what's going on today. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you look at it logically. So that's a point to understand. And by the way, this is the current global map. The most action being taken against slavery today is the Netherlands and the United States of America. We're one of the top 2 nations in the world today in fighting slavery, fighting racism. You wouldn't know that the way you watch the news and see what's happening. And that's because so many Americans have never been told this perspective, even what's happening globally. The third point is Jamestown. Now, if you listen to the 1619 Project from the New York Times, they tell us that slavery got started in America in 1619 in Jamestown. Actually, that's not what happened. What happened was in 1619, you had an English ship that captured a Portuguese slave ship off the coast of Virginia. They brought the cargo to Virginia, which included 19 slaves. Those 19 slaves weren't slaves in Virginia. What happened, those 19 slaves were made indentured servants, which meant that they served for a period of time to pay off what would have cost to feed them, etc. They were all given freedom and they were all given land. All 19 of them became, that's called an indentured servant. Indentured servant means I'm willing to become my own collateral on a loan. SpaceX they're going to take private people to the moon. Except I want to go to the moon. All right, it's going to cost $1 million. I don't have $1 million. But I think my labor is worth $50,000 a year. So SpaceX, I'll work for you for 20 years if you'll take me to the moon. You can have my $50,000 a year. I will be an indentured servant for you for 20 years. You'll get your $1 million. It's just going to be spread out. That's what an indentured servant was. I want to go to the new world. Well, it's going to cost about $10,000 and you don't have that. Well, I'll work for you 7 years, and if you'll let me work for you 7 years, then I get my freedom. I'm free. An indentured servant was not a slave. It was someone who put themselves up for collateral. So those 19 slaves became indentured servants. They were all given freedom and they were all given land by the state of Virginia. One of the guys who had been an indentured servant is a guy named Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson was a black man. He had become very prosperous, successful. He owned 250 acres, and he began sponsoring other indentured servants to come. And so they would come, they'd work for him for 7 years, he'd give them freedom, they would get land, they would go out. One of the indentured servants he had was a black man, and Anthony Johnson said, this guy is so lazy, he's so incompetent, he's so bad. Anthony Johnson went to court and asked the court, he said, instead of giving this guy his freedom in 7 years, he's so terrible, he's so sloppy and lazy, I need to own him for the rest of his life in order to pay off what I've invested in him. So can I own this guy for the rest of his life? And the Virginia court said, yeah, you can own him. So the first occasion of legal slavery in America was actually in 1651, and it was when a black man sued to own another black man. So slavery began in America when a black man asked the right to own another black man. It didn't start in 1619. It started much later than that. Actually, the first slave law in America, I think, was 1672, and that first slave law allowed you to own black slaves, white slaves, or Indian slaves. You could own any race, because slavery was at that point in time, it's not about race. So fourth is free blacks as slave owners. Now, this is an interesting thing. Free blacks as slave owners, there's a guy named Carter Woodson. Carter Woodson is the father of black history. We actually have an original, this was a book cover, Carter Woodson, there are many books about him. He's a hero of black history. He's the guy who really focused on it. This was from a book cover. This is one of the many books he did on black history. And what Carter Woodson did was take the U.S. Census and he went back to look in the southern states at free blacks in the southern states. What Carter Woodson found was that, for example, in South Carolina, 43% of free blacks in South Carolina owned black slaves. 43%? That's pretty high. Now, it's not that there were tons of free blacks in these states, but they owned slaves. Same with 40% in Louisiana, 26% in Mississippi, 25% in Alabama, 20% in Georgia. See, it's a human problem. It's not just a race problem. It's a human problem. So black on black slavery was extremely prevalent in the South. And then if you move from black on black slavery, look at these pictures. See all the Native Americans? Who are they beside? Oh, those look like black folk. They are. They're all slaves. You see, the 1860 U.S. Census reports that at the time, 1860 census, the top 5 Native American tribes in America had a higher percentage of black slaves than did whites or any other group in America. Highest percentage of black slaves were owned by Native Americans. And so Native Americans, and by the way, Native Americans, 1 out of every 8 persons, that's 12%. 12% of Native American tribes were black slaves. Native Americans also enslaved each other. And by the way, when we abolished slavery in 1865, it did not apply to the Indian tribes because they're considered foreign nations under the Constitution. Abolishment of slavery in Indian tribes came later than 1865. We had to go back and negotiate individual treaties with the tribes to end slavery in the Native tribes. So Native American slavery, they had the highest percentage of slave owners. And then you get into white slavery. Now, white slavery we don't think much about, but these are all cards of slaves that were freed when the Union took the South, New Orleans, in 1864. These are all slave cards, and you see black slaves and white slaves there. That's kind of what you see on the screen up here, is these little cards right here. And by the way, should have shown you this one earlier. This is a reward banner that was posted in Indian agencies looking for runaway slaves that got away from the Chickasaw Nation. So the Chickasaw Nation has bounties on getting their slaves back. You know, again, all races, all people had issues with slavery. So white slavery was very common at that point. Point number 7, if I take you to Muslim slave traders were looking for slaves, and often for them it was about religion rather than race. If you're not Muslim, you need to be enslaved. And so these guys specifically took 1.25 million slaves in the American founding era. 10,000 of those slaves were Americans that they took to slavery over in Europe or Africa or elsewhere. By the way, did you know that in the 16th century there were more white slaves in the Old World than there were black slaves in the New World? White slavery was a common thing. As I mentioned, that 1672 law allowed you to own blacks or whites or Indians because it was just human. We had a bad view of things. Point number 8, Southern whites, most did not own slaves. As a matter of fact, 80% of Southern whites did not own slaves. 20% did. You would think, the way we talk about it today, 100% of all Southern whites owned slaves. That's not true. And overall in the nation, 92% of Americans did not own slaves. Slave owners were a definite minority in any segment of America. Now, there's no question that there were millions of slaves in the South. No question about it. But 80% of Southerners didn't own slaves, but we can look at the stories of the South and make it really bad, and it should be really bad. But again, that's not the picture of all of America. It's not the picture of what was going on with all of America. So that's the 8th point that I'd point to. So slavery is without a primary color. It affects all humans, all race. That's 8 things you need to understand about slavery from an American standpoint. And if you understand that, it changes the narrative of what should be going on. So let me take you into some of what's going on. The 1619 Project, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, etc., are all focused on, as we see right now, the protests, everything else, even the protests yesterday with folks killed yesterday. So the 1619 Project takes as a starting point that America was founded to protect and preserve slavery. That's a bad assumption from the start. America was founded by Puritans and by Pilgrims. The Pilgrims, for example, came here in 1620. The second load of slaves that came to America came to the Pilgrims, and the Pilgrims freed all the slaves and imprisoned all the slave owners, pointing to the Bible as the reason they did so. America was not founded to protect and extend slavery. The Puritans, the Pilgrims, all over New England, those colonies, Davenport with Rhode Island and Roger Williams with Rhode Island, and what happened in Connecticut. I mean, it's just easy to prove. So that's where they take their point, which is why you get statements like U.S. Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia recently said on the floor of the Senate, the United States didn't inherit slavery from anybody, we created it. How many ways can you spell stupid? Do you guys remember something in the Bible about maybe Egyptian slavery of Hebrews? America didn't exist 3,500 years ago. We didn't create slavery. We have it in the Bible. I mean, we have ancient Greece. 30% of ancient Greece was slaves. 40% of ancient Rome was slaves. At the time Columbus landed in the New World, between 20 and 40% of Native Americans were enslaved by other Native American tribes. This is before America ever existed. The history of the world is slavery. And we created slavery? What a terrible narrative. But this is the kind of stuff that's going out today, and it's all bad on history. That's why yesterday, love of the truth is the biggest thing. You have to love truth, even if it's uncomfortable. You have to love truth. So slavery affects all races. Now, the 1619 Project actually has curriculum. The curriculum of the 1619 Project takes as a starting point that America is founded to protect and preserve slavery, and that the American constitutional system is a source of our society's ills, foremost among them being racism. So what does that tell you? If you're opposed to racism, what you need to do is you need to get rid of America's constitutional system. See the logic here? This is the way they lay it out. So that's why you see, as I showed you on statues yesterday, it's not about racist statues, because so many of those guys were civil rights leaders. So many of those statues that are being torn down are of Union generals and of Union leaders and of Abraham Lincoln, and there's no racism there. They were on the other side. Yeah, but it's tearing down the constitutional system. That's why we got to go to socialism instead of the free market. That's why we got to have Marxism instead of the constitutional system. See, it's much, much bigger than what most of us recognize. And it comes from curriculum like this. And by the way, the 1619 curriculum is being taught in all 50 states. It is in schools in all 50 states. If you got kids in school, they are being taught, most likely, the 1619 curriculum. So that's what you need to understand about part of the debate that's going on. When you look at the violence that is happening now, this in Kenosha, it's amazing to think that much destruction happens. It looks like a tornado or something else hit Kenosha, but that's what happened in Kenosha. I want to take you back and finish with the civil rights movement from MLK. The civil rights movement from MLK, the hundreds of thousands that marched with him, the millions across America that joined him, you couldn't just sign up to be part of his movement because you wanted to be. You had to sign a pledge card. This is the pledge card that went to his movement. I signed this pledge having seriously considered what I will do and the determination and will to persevere. And you chose all the things there, you put your name in, but you had to sign this card. Now, this is the bottom of the card. What's on the top of the card? What did you agree to sign to be part of the civil rights movement? I hereby pledge myself, my person, my body to the nonviolent movement. Therefore, I will keep the following 10 commandments. Number 1, meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. Number 2, remember always that the nonviolent movement in Birmingham seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. Number 3, walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. 4, pray daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free, and on through it goes. You could not be part of the civil rights movement if you didn't have a spiritual underpinning to you. Totally different. And by the way, here's the rest of the 10 commandments. This is the civil rights movement then. That's a different look from what we're seeing today. Whole different motivations. And by the way, they got different results because their objectives were different. Their tactics were different. Their knowledge was different. Everything was different about it. So that's real different from where we are today. But that's what I want to share with you this morning. We're out of time.